Hello, and I hope everyone is enjoying and learning with this edition of AI at Scale. We're certainly very excited to have all of you join us and attend this virtual session. My name is Ludovic Hauduc. I'm VP of Engineering at Meta, and I'm part of the team that delivers the AI infrastructure that Meta depends on for its AI needs. And I'd like to welcome you to our virtual edition of this Fireside chat with our very special guest. Today, I'm honored and delighted to welcome a true pioneer of AI for our Fireside chat. Unlike me, Yann LeCun does not need an introduction with this audience, but I'll say a few words. Yann is the chief AI scientist at Meta. He leads AI research for the company. He's also a Silver Professor at NYU, teaching computer science, neuroscience, and data science. He's a recipient of multiple awards, including the 2018 Turing Award. Yann, it's absolutely great to have you today, and welcome.
It's fantastic to be chatting with you.
All right. Hey, I have a lot of questions for you this morning. And I expect these questions are going to resonate a lot with this audience. But before we dive in, I'm very curious about your own personal journey with AI that led you to this position of chief AI scientist at Meta.
Well, starting from the beginning, I've been always fascinated by intelligence, the mystery of intelligence. How did intelligence emerge in evolution? You know, how does it work, etc. And being an engineer as well as a scientist, I always thought perhaps the best way to understand intelligence is to build one. There's a famous quote by Richard Feynman about this: you only understand things that you build yourself, you do yourself. So I tried to get into this when I was an undergrad studying electrical engineering. And then did a PhD on the topic, which at the time was not called machine learning, not viewed as part of AI, but it was sort of the early days of neural networks, which have now become a very successful set of techniques, and came up with a few sort of early methods that are still in use today. And then I did a postdoc at University of Toronto. I worked at Bell Labs for a number of years and AT&T Labs afterwards, and then became a professor at NYU until 2013, when Mark Zuckerberg called me and asked me to build an AI research lab for what was at the time Facebook.
Great, and the rest is history. That's awesome. Great, thank you. Well, let's dive in. You know, one of the things that makes working in AI research at Meta so unique is our ability to make long-term investments and to do that at scale. Can you give us examples of AI research projects that really stand out for you today?
Right, so we have an organization that I created when I joined called FAIR. It used to mean Facebook AI Research, and now it means Fundamental AI Research. So it's really Meta FAIR, Meta Fundamental AI Research, which is part of Reality Lab Research, kind of a bigger research organization within Meta. And the mission of FAIR is to really advance the science and technology of AI. Some projects have applications that are deployed in the relatively short term, so things like text understanding, translation, image recognition, image classification, things like that, applications in AR, VR, etc. And then a large number of projects are longer term, and 2/3 of FAIR is actually bottom up. So scientists decide what projects they work on that they think is potentially the most impactful. And that may have a horizon of 3, 5, 10 years. In fact, some of us work on things that may not have an impact for more than that. Things like attempting to get machines to learn like humans and animals, you know, reaching sort of human-level AI if you want. So this is very long term. And that requires all kinds of expertise, you know, from theory to algorithms to kind of you know, domain applications, and expertise in all kinds of domain takes a village.
Great, that's wonderful. I love the bottoms-up approach too, where we let researchers really choose what interests them and go deep in particular domains. Right. That's great. Now, when we think about the current speed and the growth of AI, which has been absolutely astounding in these past few years in particular, what bottlenecks are you seeing today? And what kind of challenges do you see might limit our ability to keep growing and keep scaling? And as a complementary question, I mean, do you see the need today for a completely new and novel approach to some of the problems we're facing?
Yes, I see a need for novel approaches. They're not entirely novel in the sense that the dominant set of methods that we use today is can be sort of broadly construed as deep learning.
Mm-hmm.
So all based on machine learning, but training machines that are fairly complex and can learn fairly complex things. So one thing we need to do, which is necessary but not sufficient, is scaling up those models, because as we make them bigger, they get better. As we train them on more data, they get better. But we can't train them on more data that has been annotated by humans, which is the traditional way of doing machine learning. It's called supervised learning. What has happened over the last few years is that, particularly in natural language processing, we're now using something called self-supervised learning, which allows us to train the system on a lot of data that doesn't need to be annotated. And so that allows the system to be much bigger and be trained on enormous amounts of data beforehand, before we specialize it for a number of tasks. But even that is not sufficient. So there are some people in the community who say, we just need to scale this up, and eventually we'll reach human level AI or whatever it is which goal we have. I don't believe that. So I think we're missing some essential pieces when we see how efficiently humans and animals can learn new tasks, and how our machine learning systems are not nearly as good. I think we're missing some essential pieces. I actually wrote a long position paper about my idea for where AI research should go in the next 10 years, where I explain a bit of what I think is missing there.
And you talked a little bit about self-supervised learning. Can you give a little bit more examples or go a little bit more details into what that is and how that's maybe helped us in recent development achieve something that would not have been possible previously without that technique?
Right. So a very simple way of explaining self-supervised learning is learning to fill in the blanks, essentially, right? So you take a piece of data, imagine it's a video or a piece of text, and you mask part of it. So for example, of a video, you show a clip and then you don't show the remainder of the clip. And you train the machine to essentially predict what happens next. In the case of text, you can train it to predict the next word in a text, or you can take a piece of text, remove 20% of the words, and then ask the machine to predict the words that are missing. And in the process of doing this prediction, the system has to learn the sort of internal structure of the data, if you want. And so this is unlabeled data, right? It's just raw text or video or images or whatever. And so what you get out of the machine trained this way is a representation of the data that contains the sort of relevant pieces of information, if you want, in some sort of nice abstract way. And now you can use that representation as input to a downstream task, be it translation, topic classification in text, detection of hate speech, for example, things like that, or image recognition, segmentation, etc. So that really has been a revolution in natural language processing in particular over the last 5 years or so. And it's just about to have the same effect in computer vision, but not yet. The methods that work well for natural language processing, for self-supervised learning, don't actually work that well for vision, so we're inventing new ones, essentially.
Got it. Yeah, it's fascinating. And it really gets me thinking about the underlying resources that are necessary to power these kind of systems. And being on the infrastructure side of AI, scale truly is the name of the game. And I'm curious about this following question. Now, AI is very ubiquitous. We've heard some industry concerns around the significant increase in processing power necessary on the compute side to power the AI systems that Meta and other companies use today. What's your thoughts on the impact on sustainability that AI might have? And I'm curious about how you contemplate the future of AI and whether the aspirations we have in the future take the sustainability aspect into consideration as well.
Right. Okay. So right now, the proportion of energy spent on AI relative to everything else is very small. Within Meta, within Google. Google actually has published a paper on what their prediction was for like what the proportion of would be, and that's essentially determined by economics. The amount of infrastructure that a company like Meta can devote to computing is limited by economics, and then within this, the portion that is devoted to AI is also limited by economics. Most of it is spent actually running machine learning systems that do ranking and things of that type. A smaller, tiny proportion of it is devoted to training for production, so training production systems. And then an even smaller proportion of this is devoted to research, essentially. And so when you look at the numbers and you see like, how much energy is spent training a very large experimental natural language understanding system, for example, your eye pop out because it looks, it's the same as 5 cars during their lifetime. But in fact, in proportion to everything else, it's actually relatively small. And so now the question is, is this going to grow exponentially faster than all of the rest? Are we going to be able to power this, in ways that are sustainable? So Meta's operations are actually carbon neutral at the moment, and in the end, it's not a problem as big as people think it is. But I must say, the computational efficiency of AI systems today is about a factor of 100,000 or a million worse than what we observe in biology. Our brain has an enormous amount of compute power, and it consumes 25 watts. Yeah. And we would need maybe 100,000 GPU cards, that each consume 300 watts to kind of even approach the computational power. So we need to make progress. The good thing is that there is a huge amount of incentive for all companies to work really hard on reducing power consumption for AI.
That's a fascinating analogy in terms of the brain consumption of energy and what we would need to expand today to even get close to even mimicking the most rudimentary aspect of what the human brain can do.
Yeah, it's only 5 orders of magnitude.
No, that's awesome. So staying on the topic of scale, which is one that's, again, very close and dear to my heart. In the past years, we've been throwing scale at the problem, just really getting more compute, more scalability into our AI systems. But there's probably a time where we're going to run out of scale, or where scale is not necessarily going to help you. I'm just curious as to how you think about that next inflection point or step function of innovation that's going to be needed to help us go through some of the barriers that we're running into right now with AI.
Yeah, I think the first thing is sort of new algorithms that or new architectures, I would say, even new paradigms. So new paradigms would be things like, massively using self-supervised learning and things like that, right? And what we discover with self-supervised learning is that we don't need to train a separate model for every task that we're doing. We basically have one gigantic model that does everything for NLP, another gigantic one that does everything for images. And so we only need to train one and then reuse it for the various tasks that we need to do. So that's actually a saving in some respect. It used to be that whenever a photo was uploaded on Facebook and Instagram, it had to run through something like 6 different convolutional nets to do different things like detecting nudity and various other things. And now it's basically one big one. But it's cheaper than running the 6 separate ones, right? In many ways. So that's the first thing, sort of new learning paradigms, new architectures, new ways to optimize the architectures after they're trained. There's a lot of work on sort of basically pruning and minimizing the size of networks and quantizing the weights, etc., so that you can run them really efficiently after they're trained. So that's all software and concepts and algorithms. And then there is, of course, specialized hardware. And so, running neural nets on specialized hardware in production is something that takes a while because you have to design new chips or kind of, retool your entire system. So this is something that certainly Meta has worked on, as well as other companies. And then perhaps in the future, there might be sort of completely new underlying technologies, fabrication technology, or new hardware concepts that will kind of reduce the power consumption. So what we know is that And again, there is a huge incentive to work on this because we need very low power AI systems to run in AR glasses, for example. We'd like to be able to do a lot of intelligent things in AR glasses and have the battery last an entire day. There might be in a near future or not too distant future kind of new concepts in hardware that will drastically reduce the energy consumption.
That's amazing. One thing you said at the very beginning, in fact, in your introduction, is your early interest in understanding intelligence and trying to replicate it. It's been a few decades since you had that dream. We've seen incredible advances in AI, mostly through the research that you've done. How close are we from starting to emulate the human brain and intelligence? And we've seen things like BlenderBot and other efforts that give the appearance of intelligence, but how close are we to getting close to that?
So we're close and not close. We're close in the sense that it's pretty clear to me that once we get to systems that may be capable of, let's say, human-level AI, we'll recognize a lot of the technologies that we currently use or the techniques that we currently use in those systems. They will use things like gradient-based learning, which is really deep learning. They will use forms of neural nets that may combine things like convolutional nets and transformers that are particular architectures that we use today, and perhaps new ones that we will invent. So I think we'll recognize a lot of that, but I think we're still missing essential pieces. And humans and many animals are capable of basically learning how the world works from observation. We don't know how to do this yet with machines, even with the self-supervised learning methods that we have. Those kind of predictive models of the world that humans and animals can learn allows them to plan and reason. And our current neural nets basically don't reason, really. You take an input and you run it through the neural net, and after a finite amount of time, you get an answer. And there is no process inside current crops of deep learning system that allow systems to kind of reason, think about things, and plan, right? So that's what's missing. It's not that we have ideas of how to do this. It's going to take quite a while to actually make it work, and it may fail. But if we succeed, I think we'll have, it will be kind of a step towards intelligence that looks more like what we observe in animals and humans. Like the smartest AI systems today have less common sense and understanding of the world than a house cat.
Maybe not with my own cats, but I can see the analogy. No, this is fascinating, and I think it really shows how we learn not through a single mode, but with a multiple set of sensory inputs, and that training happens in a very complex manner that you've explained is very complicated and difficult to replicate. So
that's a trend also in AI to kind of train the newest models, multimodal. So they're not trained just with text
or video
or just images, but they're trained with sort of multiple streams and try to sort of relate all those streams. I have a paper, actually it's a philosophy paper, it's not a technical paper, on why I think AI systems trained purely on text cannot actually, are very limited in their understanding of the world, right? They don't have an experience of an underlying reality, and as a result, their understanding is very superficial. And so I think I'm a believer in what's called grounded AI, so we need those systems to have an experience of an underlying reality, whether it is simulated or actual physical reality.
Now that makes a lot of sense. So AI is fascinating to all of us in the technology field. It can also look or appear scary or hard to understand. So there's technical but also cultural aspect that comes in when we talk about AI. I'm curious about your thoughts when you think about the biggest opportunities, but also challenges that AI and machine learning can have in the future in this technical and cultural context.
Yeah, there is effects of using AI systems and machine learning systems more generally, or statistical models, for sort of massive communication platforms like like Facebook and Instagram and many others. And those challenges are due to the fact that it's never been done before. And so you deploy a system, and then you have to measure the effect, and you want to deploy it in a small way so that you see the effect before, if there are bad effects, you can correct them before they really get bad. And sometimes there is an effect that you couldn't predict. And so you have to correct quickly. So I think the challenges are due to the fact that whenever there is a new technology, there are things that you don't foresee that occur, and then they need to be addressed really quickly, which I think a lot of people at Meta are very, realize this and are working on, such technology all the time. So, for example, for content moderation, technology was developed within FAIR, actually, for doing things like doing content moderation in multiple languages. It's very difficult to have enough human content moderators to do things like taking down hate speech in every language in the world. But if you have a multilingual text understanding system that has some level of understanding of what hate speech really is in every language, then you can automate a lot of it. And then if you have good translation system, you can use human moderators as kind of a second step in whatever their favorite language is. So those technologies actually have allowed, for example, Facebook to make a huge amount of progress just in the last 3-4 years in things like taking down hate speech and other objectionable content. And it's entirely due to progress in AI. It's the self-supervised learning techniques for NLP that really allowed this progress.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing these thoughts. I mean, that really helps kind of complement the picture, even for me, on how AI continues to improve, but not just from a technical standpoint, in terms of how it adapts to the changing landscape. So fascinating stuff. I want to go back to something that's closer to your day job, the research aspect, the fundamental research aspect, the F in FAIR, which I learned just recently, actually. I was still stuck on Facebook on this one. But when you think about the way Meta does research, and in particular, the way we support open science as part of how we do research, I'm curious about your thoughts on how this lean towards open science helps, and how you see that in the future, and how we will continue approaching research as part of that mindset.
Right. So there's an interesting story about this, which is that when I was being recruited by Mark Zuckerberg and Mike Schroepfer, who was the CTO at the time, one thing I told them right away was, you can't really have a research lab unless you practice open research and everything is published and possibly open sourced. And Schrepp's answer was, you don't have to worry about it. This isn't the DNA of the company. Like, I come from the open source world. We've been doing this all the time. Like, you don't have to worry about it. And as I said, that sounds great, because research was not as open in the old days. People published, but they didn't publish code. Companies weren't used to the idea of open source back in the 1980s and 90s. So I kind of set it as a mission of FAIR to really practice open research. And the advantage is you're out in the world, you publish your research, there's like multiple advantages of this. One of the big one is you get people to get interested in your own problems. And you're out in the world, you attract the best researchers. If you're a company that tries to hire a scientist, and you tell the scientist, you can't talk about what you're doing here, you basically kill their career as a scientist. And so people will hesitate to do this. We don't have that problem at FAIR. We tell people, actually, it's the other way around. Publish everything. In fact, your performance will be evaluated partly on what you publish. And I think that had a big impact, not just on FAIR, but on the world of AI more generally. I think the whole research landscape in AI accelerated in part because we started to do open research, and it sort of incentivized other like Google and Microsoft, etc., to also become much more open. And so now everybody uses everybody else's open source code, and that led to an acceleration of progress.
I love how the cultural piece, which is where you started from, really influence our ability to do more and accelerate on the research side. So I love the kind of the symbiotic aspect of that.
Yeah, and it's because the problem is not whether we are 6 months ahead of Google or Microsoft or whatever. The problem is that there are things we want to do with AI for which we do not have the underlying science.
Right.
And solving those scientific problems will take the entire research community. We don't have a monopoly on good ideas at FAIR. Industry doesn't have a monopoly on good ideas. A lot of good ideas come out of academia, so we need to sort of engage the entire research community.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Any recent examples where we opened some research and where that generated some interest and benefits?
Well, a good example is PyTorch. Okay, so it's a tool that we developed on top of Torch, which was kind of the ancestor of PyTorch. And that became essentially the dominant platform for research in AI over the last few years.
Right.
I mean, certainly in the research domain, engineering TensorFlow is pretty successful as well. And so that's an example. But then in sort of more research, there is there are two pieces of open source codes that are used daily by a lot of people, including a lot of startups that are kind of built around it. One is Detectron 2, which is sort of the kind of computer vision library and platform on top of PyTorch. And the other one is FairSeq, which is more for like text and sequential data and things like that. And so those two pieces of software are used, open source software, and underlying algorithms are used by everyone. And then there are re-implementations of this by companies like Hugging Face, who kind of has the mission of sort of popularizing a lot of models that are published in the literature, and so re-implementing them. So that had a big impact, but also other impact. The progress in NLP that I was mentioning, right. There were maybe an early breakthrough, which is the idea of augmenting neural nets with memory, and that came out of FAIR in 2014-15. There were other work on this before, but that came out of FAIR essentially. Then there was another idea that came out of the University of Montreal in Mila, Yoshua Benjo's lab in Montreal, that allowed a neural net to sort of dynamically figure out which part of the neural net should be paid attention to. So this is called attention, more generally. Then those two ideas were combined by people at Google to build a so-called transformer architecture, which turned out to be really successful for NLP and all kinds of, and even for vision nowadays. And then there was the idea of kind of using this architecture and training it in a self-supervised manner. So one of the first papers on this was from Google, BERT. And then there was kind of a similar system at FAIR called Roberta. And then various extensions of this. And all of this fed into progress in NLP. And every large company that uses NLP uses some form of this, using some form of the code that was produced either by Meta or by Google or by Hugging Face or another one. There is literally dozens of startups that have appeared in the last year or two that are entirely based on basically using what's called large language models and sort of trying to find useful users for them. So it's spurred an industry, and it's scientific progress from academia, industry, various industries, and publishing papers quickly. The BERT paper took the world by storm. It had something like 600 citations before it got actually officially published, just as a preprint in a few months.
I love the inherently collaborative aspect of the space, which, one of the reasons we're having AI at scale is to foster that community. And, you also said we don't have monopoly on good ideas, and we're really welcoming the collaborations. That's amazing. So a lot of the techniques that we think about today in the area of AI and that we sometimes take for granted, a lot of these came from research that you started or ideas that you promoted and things that you made happen over the course of the past few years. When you project yourself in the future, Yann, what are your greatest hopes, I guess, and maybe concerns also when you think about AI and the direction it's taking?
Well, the hope is the same that I've had since I got interested in this. Is what is the sort of underlying mechanisms of intelligence and learning? So intelligence always emerges from learning. whether it's learning in the individual or learning through evolution. It's another form of learning. So how does that happen? What's the principles of kind of self-organization, if you want, that allow this to happen? And then, how do you actually make it work, right? How do you create intelligence or learning systems that can be as smart as animals, perhaps humans, perhaps go beyond humans? I mean, we have systems today that have superhuman performance, but they usually are very narrow, right? In very narrow fields, narrow tasks, and that makes them somewhat brittle. So, can we get machines to understand the world, essentially? So that's still the hope. I think this was a distant goal up until fairly recently, and I think because of progress in hardware and scaling, etc., new concepts, self-supervised learning, things like that, I think we're kind of seeing perhaps a path towards that. And in fact, the paper I was mentioning earlier is the title is A Path Towards Autonomous Machine Intelligence. So it's more of a proposal than an actual research report, but that's I'm very hopeful for the future. Now the flip side of this is how do we make sure that AI is used for the good of humanity, right? And that is a political question. It's not a technological question. So technology always disrupts society in some ways, and society has to adapt and take measures to make sure that the technology is used for the benefit of everyone, and not for dangerous things, first of all, and not for the benefits of just a few.
That's amazing. Well, this is incredibly insightful, Yann, and I personally learned a few things today, and I got personally even more excited about being part of the AI movement, and especially with people like you and our research team at Meta, and kind of the hopes we have for the future, as you just talked about. Anything that you'd like to share in closing as we kind of wrap up and think about the topics we've covered today? Anything that you'd like to share with the audience on how you're thinking about what's next for you personally and for the future of AI?
Okay, so for future of AI, I think there is a huge amount of opportunities in the use of AI and sort of sophisticated machine learning methods in the sciences. So of course, we talk about it in business, in communication technology, etc. But a lot of people now are working on using AI systems to develop models of physical processes or biological processes or things like that. And those models are phenomenological, so they don't really explain the underlying mechanics of things, but they allow us to predict. That would be very important, for example, to be able to design new drugs, to design new proteins that could, stick at a particular place on a site and have a biological effect, design new chemical compounds, and chemical compounds or new materials. And that may help with not just with health and medicine, but also with things like climate change. So what if we could design a new compound, a catalyst that would facilitate the separation of hydrogen from oxygen using electricity from, let's say, solar panels? Then we would basically solve climate change. We would sort of base the economy on hydrogen. Now, we actually have a project at FAIR on this. It's called the Open Catalyst project, and it's an open collaborative project with people outside Meta, with Carnegie Mellon chemical engineering department in particular, but it's an open challenge. And we have like a number of projects like this, one also on protein, kind of predicting the structure of protein, but also kind of designing proteins to have a particular effects. So we have several efforts like this that don't seem connected with the main business line of Meta, but would be good for the world, would be useful to everyone, and AI is very likely to have a big impact there. That's me personally, I'm actually focusing on this, research towards human level type AI, and a number of people at FAIR also are. So,
I love closing on AI as a source for good and a force for good in the world. So, thank you so much, Yann, for this conversation. Really appreciate you joining us today.
It was a pleasure.
And to our friends at AI at Scale, thank you.